They thought prison would be the end of it. A sentence, a cell, time served. But for people who kill babies, the punishment doesn't stop at the courtroom door. Inside prison, that crime carries a different weight. Guards don't need to say anything. Other inmates already know. And the first name on that list is a man who didn't make it far past his cell door. Liam Dean, Wakefield, West Yorkshire, 2016. Liam Dean was 22 years old, living with his partner and their newborn daughter in a small flat. The baby, Luna, was just 5 weeks old, too young to crawl, too young to speak, old enough only to cry when something was wrong. On the night she was injured, Luna's mother was asleep in another room. Dean was alone with the baby. Later, he would admit that Luna wouldn't stop crying. What happened next was brief, violent, and irreversible. Dean shook her, hard enough to cause catastrophic brain injuries. Luna was taken to hospital, where doctors quickly realized the damage was beyond repair. Swelling on the brain, internal bleeding, injuries consistent with force, far beyond anything accidental. She died 2 days later. Police arrested Dean and began questioning him. There was no long investigation, no competing suspects. Medical evidence pointed in one direction, and Dean eventually accepted responsibility. In court, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. At sentencing, the judge described the violence as extreme and the victim as utterly defenseless. Dean was given a life sentence, with a minimum term of 6 years before parole could even be considered. The courtroom was quiet when the sentence was read. For the family, the legal process was over. For Dean, it was just beginning. He was transferred into the prison system and eventually placed at HMP Leeds, a high-security prison holding inmates serving long sentences for violent crimes. Inside, information travels quickly. Dean didn't need to talk about his case. Other inmates already knew, a man who killed his own baby. That detail alone was enough. By the summer of 2018, Dean was sharing a cell with another prisoner, John Westland, a convicted sex offender. The pairing was meant to manage space, not safety. On the night of September 13, 2018, guards carried out a routine check. Dean didn't respond. When officers entered the cell, they found him unresponsive, with severe head injuries. Attempts to revive him failed. He was pronounced dead inside the prison. The investigation was immediate. Westland was arrested and later charged with murder. Prosecutors described a sustained attack inside the shared cell. The motive was never disputed. Dean's crime was enough. Westland was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 19 years. Liam Dean never served the sentence given to him by the court. Because inside prison, his punishment arrived early, and his death sent a message that didn't stay within those walls. Because the next man on this list wasn't impulsive, he didn't lose control in a moment. He planned, he waited, and when he was finally locked up, prison made its own decision. Anthony Palmer, Norman, Oklahoma, autumn 1998. On a cool September morning, 3-year-old Faith Hathaway walked out the front door of her family's home to wait for her school bus. Her bright smile and easy laugh were familiar to neighbors. She was the kind of little girl everyone knew. But that morning, she never made it to school. Faith vanished without a trace. Her disappearance triggered a massive search effort. Local police combed the neighborhood. Volunteers joined block by block. Flyers went up. Rumors spread. Everyone hoped she would be found safe. Days passed with no sign of Faith. Then, the worst news came. Anthony Palmer, a local man with no apparent connection to the Hathaway family, was arrested near the scene. Investigators had traced him through witness sightings and vehicle descriptions. Cell phone records and physical evidence eventually placed him close to the time and place where Faith disappeared. In questioning, Palmer's behavior was chillingly calm. He gave vague answers, no emotion, no remorse. Despite conflicting statements, the evidence against him continued to mount. Inside his home, police found items that raised alarms. Clothing, objects, and details that suggested a deeper connection to the missing child than Palmer admitted. Ultimately, prosecutors built their case not on a single moment of panic or desperation, but on patterns and opportunity. Evidence placing Palmer near Faith's disappearance. physical clues found during the investigation, and a trail that linked him more tightly to the crime than he ever acknowledged. At trial, the prosecution laid out a narrative that was methodical, detailed, and deliberate. They called witnesses who placed Palmer in the area. Forensic experts testified about the physical clues recovered. And slowly, the picture that emerged was one of a man who had crossed a boundary no parent or community should ever know. The jury saw that picture clearly. Anthony Palmer was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection with Faith's disappearance and killing. He was sentenced to death, a sentence reserved in Oklahoma for what the law deems the most heinous crimes. Palmer was sent to death row in the Oklahoma state prison system. The isolation, the regimen, the slow passage of days. All of it was part of a penitentiary designed for people society has declared beyond redemption. But even death row had rules. Convicted killers, even those condemned themselves, know the moral lines prisoners observe, and one line runs deeper than most: harming children. Despite the severity of his sentence, Palmer didn't escape the prison hierarchy. He lived inside it. And like many in his position, he learned fast that notoriety as a child killer can be isolating and dangerous. In 2005, while still on death row, Palmer was attacked by another inmate. The assault was unprovoked and severe, leaving him with injuries that hospital staff described as life-altering. According to prison records and reports from other inmates, the attacker targeted Palmer specifically because of the nature of his crime, a violation that, even among hardened criminals, marks a deeper taboo. The assault was reported internally, and the prison treated it as a serious incident. Palmer survived, but the message was clear. Even inside a system built on punishment, there are boundaries that most prisoners enforce themselves. Palmer remained on death row, living under both the state sentence and the unspoken verdict of his peers, until his execution date was set. In 2007, Anthony Palmer was executed by lethal injection. Even in his final hours, his case continued to draw attention from legal observers, local communities, and media, a reminder that a crime against a child reverberates far beyond the courtroom. His execution marked the end of one terrifying chapter, and the beginning of another conversation about crime, punishment, and the ways society and prison culture intersect when moral codes collide. And next is a crime that unfolded slowly, in public, and under constant scrutiny. Roy Whiting, West Sussex, England, summer 2000. 8-year-old Sarah Payne was visiting her grandparents near the Sussex coast. The area was quiet, familiar, and rural, one of those places where children played outside and adults assumed someone nearby was always watching. On July 1st, Sarah went out to play. She didn't return. What began as concern quickly became alarm. Police were contacted. Neighbors searched gardens, lanes, and nearby fields. As hours passed, the scale of the search expanded. Officers, volunteers, dogs, and helicopters were deployed across the countryside. Within days, Sarah's disappearance dominated national news. Her photograph appeared everywhere: television broadcasts, newspaper front pages, shop windows. The country followed each update closely, hoping for a different ending. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a field miles from where she had last been seen. The investigation shifted immediately. Attention turned to Roy Whiting, a local man living nearby. Whiting was not unknown to authorities. He had previous convictions involving a child and had served a prison sentence years earlier before returning to the area. During questioning, Whiting denied responsibility, but as the investigation continued, evidence accumulated. Witness accounts placed him in the area. Forensic findings connected him to the crime. Gradually, the case against him solidified. At trial, the proceedings were heavily attended and closely reported. Security was tight. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was controlled but tense, reflecting the weight of a case that had already left a deep mark on the public. In December 2001, Roy Whiting was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court indicating that he should never be released. There was no statement that brought closure, no explanation that softened the outcome. Outside the courtroom, Sarah Payne's name had already become more than part of a case file. The investigation and its outcome led directly to changes in how information about convicted child offenders could be shared with the public, reforms that would later become known as Sarah's Law. Whiting was transferred into the high-security prison system. There, his crime followed him. In prison, certain convictions carry lasting consequences, not written into law but reflected in how an inmate must be managed. Whiting was considered high risk, not only because of the seriousness of his offense, but because of the attention it continued to attract. He spent long periods under strict supervision, often separated, frequently moved. Facilities such as H.M. Prison Frankland were used to house him, institutions designed for prisoners who cannot be safely accommodated elsewhere. For Whiting, life imprisonment meant more than time served. It meant a life defined by restriction, isolation, and permanent association with a crime the country never forgot. He remains incarcerated, and his name remains inseparable from one child. Because the next case on this list doesn't involve a man already known to police. It involves someone trusted within a hospital, and crimes uncovered only after patterns began to emerge. Lucy Letby. Chester, England. Mid-2000s. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was designed for the most fragile patients, premature and critically ill babies whose survival depended on routine, precision, and trust. Lucy Letby worked there as a neonatal nurse. She was considered quiet, methodical, reliable, someone parents were told they could trust. Between 2015 and 2016, something began to trouble staff. Babies who had been stable suddenly deteriorated. Some collapsed without warning. Others failed to respond to treatment in ways doctors couldn't explain. At first, each incident was treated on its own. Neonatal care is unpredictable. Complications happen. Loss, while devastating, is not unheard of. But patterns started to emerge. Senior clinicians noticed that the same nurse appeared on duty during an unusually high number of incidents. Internal reviews were held. Meetings followed. Concerns were raised, quietly at first, then formally. Eventually, the hospital contacted police. What followed was one of the most complex medical investigations in modern British history. Detectives examined years of medical records. They reconstructed shift patterns. They brought in independent medical experts from across the country. Each case was reviewed individually, then collectively. The conclusion was slow, careful, and unprecedented. Lucy Letby was arrested. She denied wrongdoing. Her trial unfolded over many months at Manchester Crown Court. Jurors were asked to absorb technical medical evidence, timelines, expert testimony, and handwritten notes recovered from her home. Among them were messages in which Letby referred to herself as evil and expressed an inability to cope with what had happened. Documents, the prosecution argued, revealed consciousness of guilt, and the defense said reflected emotional distress. The jury deliberated for weeks. In August 2023, Lucy Letby was convicted of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder involving babies in her care. She was sentenced to whole life imprisonment, meaning she will never be released. The sentence was read without drama. There was no statement from Letby. Outside the court, families spoke of loss, unanswered questions, and a sense of betrayal that would never fully fade. Letby was transferred into the high-security prison system. Her status was immediately clear, not because of notoriety alone, but because of the nature of her crimes. Within prison, some offenses require special management. Letby's was one of them. She was housed under strict conditions with limited contact, constant supervision, and heightened security measures. Her daily life became controlled and solitary, not as an extra punishment, but as a necessity. She remains incarcerated, serving a sentence that has no endpoint, and her case reshaped how hospitals across the UK monitor unusual patterns, raise internal concerns, and escalate them sooner. Changes written into policy after the damage was already done. But the next case doesn't involve a hospital or a professional setting. It involves a child placed into care and a system that believed it was offering protection. Savannah Brockhill, West Midlands, England, 2017. 4-year-old Frankie Smith had already lived through instability most adults never experience. His early life involved temporary care arrangements, supervision orders, and decisions made by professionals tasked with keeping him safe. By 2017, Frankie was living with his mother and her partner, Savannah Brockhill, a teenager at the time. Brockhill was 17 years old. The placement was considered appropriate. Assessments had been carried out. There were no active warnings that suggested immediate danger. On paper, the situation appeared stable enough. Behind closed doors, it wasn't. Over time, Frankie began to show signs of distress, bruising, behavioral changes, concerns that, individually, might not have triggered alarm, but together told a different story. On September 18, 2017, emergency services were called to the home. Frankie was found unresponsive. He was taken to hospital where doctors attempted to save him. He died shortly afterward. Medical examinations revealed extensive internal injuries consistent with repeated force. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Attention turned to Brockhill, who had been alone with Frankie at the time. She initially denied responsibility, offering explanations that failed to align with the medical findings. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors described a pattern of ongoing harm rather than a single incident. The case went to trial at Coventry Crown Court. Because of Brockhill's age at the time of the offence, reporting restrictions initially applied. Even so, the case drew national attention, not only because of the crime, but because of the questions it raised about oversight, risk assessment, and decision-making within the care system. In 2018, Savannah Brockhill was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term before parole consideration. In court, the judge addressed the seriousness of the offence and the vulnerability of the victim. There was no ambiguity in the sentence. For the agencies involved, the case prompted internal reviews. For the public, it reignited debates about safeguarding and whether warning signs had been missed. Brockhill entered the prison system still very young. Her conviction placed her into a category requiring close supervision, not only because of the severity of the crime, but because of the attention surrounding it. She was housed in facilities designed to manage high-risk and high-profile inmates, including HMP Downview. Life inside was structured, restricted, and closely monitored. Her sentence is ongoing. Frankie Smith's name, meanwhile, became part of official reports, serious case reviews, and policy discussions, documents that examine not only what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. Because the next case on this list doesn't involve a partner or a care placement. It involves a nurse, trusted by parents, relied on by hospitals, whose actions were uncovered only after patterns repeated again and again. Janine Jones, Texas. Late 1970s to early 1980s. Janine Jones was a licensed vocational nurse working with children. She was employed in hospitals and later in home health settings, caring for some of the most vulnerable patients, infants and young children with serious medical needs. To parents, she appeared attentive. To colleagues, intense but committed. At first, no one questioned the outcomes. Children under Jones's care experienced sudden medical emergencies. Breathing stopped, heart rates dropped, resuscitation attempts followed. In several cases, the children did not survive. Each incident was treated as a tragedy. Then another occurred, and another. At a pediatric unit in San Antonio, staff began to notice something unsettling. The emergencies seemed to happen when Jones was present. Not always, but often enough to raise quiet concern. Hospital administrators reviewed records. They found no immediate explanation. Jones eventually left the hospital and began working as a private duty nurse, caring for children in their homes. The pattern continued. In 1982, a baby named Chelsea McClellan died while under Jones's care. This time, the circumstances did not fade into paperwork. The child's parents pressed for answers. Medical examiners identified a suspicious injection site. Investigators became involved. What followed was a careful reconstruction of cases spanning years. Prosecutors alleged that Jones had deliberately induced medical crises by administering dangerous substances, then attempted resuscitation, placing herself at the center of repeated emergencies. In 1984, Janine Jones was charged with murder. At trial, The jury heard testimony from medical experts, colleagues, and families. The case did not rely on one incident alone, but on patterns, timing, access, and repeated unexplained collapses linked to a single caregiver. Jones maintained her innocence. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For years, the full scope of her actions remained uncertain. Records were incomplete. Some cases could not be prosecuted due to time limits or lack of preserved evidence. Investigators believed the number of victims could be significantly higher than those named in court. Jones entered the Texas prison system, housed in facilities for women serving long sentences, including the Mountain View unit. Her incarceration was quiet. No appeals that changed the outcome. No public statements. Decades later, in 2017, Jones was released on parole due to legal technicalities related to sentencing laws at the time of her conviction. The decision was met with public concern, particularly from families connected to earlier cases. In response, prosecutors brought new charges related to another child's death. In 2020, Janine Jones pleaded guilty to an additional count of murder. She was sentenced again, this time ensuring she would remain in prison for the rest of her life. Her case led to widespread changes in hospital oversight, medication control, and reporting standards, reforms written after years of missed patterns. But for many families, answers came too late. And the next case on this list doesn't involve a hospital or a professional license. It involves a mother whose children kept dying and whose grief was believed for years. Mary Beth Tinning, Schenectady, New York, 1970s and 1980s. For years, Mary Beth Tinning was known as a grieving mother. Between 1972 and 1985, 9 of her children died. Some were infants, others were toddlers. Each death came with a medical explanation: respiratory failure, heart problems, sudden illness, or causes that could not be fully determined. Doctors offered sympathy. Neighbors brought meals. Friends attended funerals. No one suspected a crime. Infant death, while devastating, was not unheard of, and each case, taken on its own, seemed tragic rather than suspicious. There were no obvious signs of injury, no clear evidence that demanded further investigation. So the deaths were recorded, and then forgotten. Mary Beth and her husband continued to have children, and the pattern continued. By the time her 9th child, 4-month-old Tammy Lynn, died in 1985, medical staff began to hesitate. The number alone was difficult to explain. An autopsy was ordered. This time, the findings were different. Doctors determined that Tammy Lynn had died from asphyxiation. Police were notified. Investigators reviewed the history of the previous deaths, something that had never been done collectively before. When they questioned Mary Beth, she initially denied any wrongdoing. Then, under further questioning, she confessed, but only partially. She admitted responsibility for Tammy Lynn's death and suggested that overwhelming stress had played a role. She did not admit to harming the other children. Without physical evidence from earlier cases, prosecutors could only move forward on one charge. In 1987, Mary Beth Tinning pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. In court, there were no dramatic statements, no public explanation that could account for 9 deaths, only a record that showed how long belief and sympathy had delayed scrutiny. Mary Beth was sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison for women. Her incarceration was quiet. She received visits. She maintained her innocence regarding most of the deaths. For decades, families and investigators debated how many children had truly been harmed and whether the system had failed by not asking questions sooner. In 2018, after serving more than 30 years, Mary Beth Tinning was released on parole. The decision reignited public discussion, not only about her case, but about how repeated, unexplained deaths in one family are handled by medical and legal systems. Her name remains linked to unanswered questions, because while she admitted to one crime, the full truth was never fully established. And the next case on this list involves a child killer, whose actions weren't hidden behind sympathy or medical language. They were carried out openly, and followed by one of the longest prison sentences in American history. Wesley Dodd, Vancouver, Washington, late 1980s. Wesley Allen Dodd lived quietly. He held jobs that brought him into everyday contact with the public. To neighbors, he was unremarkable, someone who blended easily into routine life. What no one around him knew was that Dodd was already documenting his own thoughts in journals, not memories, not reflections, plans. In 1989, a young boy disappeared in Vancouver. His body was later found in a wooded area. Then another child vanished, and then another. Each case shook the community, but investigators struggled to connect them. Dodd was careful. He avoided attention. He learned from mistakes. In 1989, police arrested him for an unrelated offense involving a child. During questioning, something shifted. Faced with mounting evidence, Dodd began to speak. What he revealed was worse than anyone expected. He confessed to the abduction and murder of 3 young boys. He provided locations, details only the perpetrator could know. His journals corroborated his statements, methodical, detached, and precise. There was no claim of confusion, no attempt to soften responsibility. At trial, prosecutors presented the evidence without theatrics. The facts were enough. The jury deliberated briefly. Wesley Allen Dodd was convicted of multiple counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. In court, Dodd waived many of his appeals. He did not ask for leniency. Instead, he argued that execution was the only appropriate outcome for what he had done. He was sent to death row at the Washington State Penitentiary. His time there was defined by isolation and strict supervision. Dodd did not seek public sympathy. He did not attempt to reframe his actions. In statements and correspondence, he continued to accept responsibility, while acknowledging the permanent damage he had caused. In 1993, after repeatedly requesting that his execution proceed without delay, Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging, the last person to be executed that way in the United States. His final statement did not offer comfort. Instead, it underscored the severity of his crimes and the reality that some actions leave no path forward. The case prompted changes in how offender writings are monitored, how risk is assessed after release, and how communities respond to early warning signs that had once gone unnoticed. Dodd's name is now confined to records, court transcripts, and cautionary discussions about prevention. But the impact of his actions remains.